Welcome back to Prepare for the Next Level. Have you ever wondered how college admissions boards evaluate standardized testing? Or maybe which test you should take? The SAT, the ACT, the SAT-2, all three? Well, joining us today is Jen Duran, someone who can definitely answer those questions for us. Jen is a former admissions officer and assistant director of diversity recruitment for Columbia University. She's also served as a college counselor to students in the tri-state area, so knows it from both angles. Jen, thanks so much for taking out the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
Now, Jen, you're one of those people that really can take us inside the admissions room. So I'm wondering, how much of a piece of the puzzle are these standardized test scores?
Well, standardized test scores are one of three components that are really considered in the admission process, especially the competitive admission process. Obviously, the most important component would be the transcript, the student's academic performance over the course of 4 years. That's the most important predictor of how a student's going to do. Extracurricular activities are also really important for students. Colleges actually take a look at that, and they consider that heavily. And then finally, testing. So testing is one of the three main ingredients.
How would you say the entire process has changed over the years with regard to test scores? How much more important are they now than maybe they were 15, 20, 30 years ago?
Sure. They're much more important now. I applied to college in the early 90s, and when I applied, the admission rates were somewhere in the 20%. Today, with competitive admission sometimes even reaching 9, 10%, it's just much more competitive. So test scores become much more important. When you're applying to schools that are admitting so few students and they're looking at students with such stellar transcripts and stellar extracurricular profiles, the testing becomes a tiebreaker often.
Now, obviously, I have some questions for you, but this is a show for the students, so we wanted to get out there and find out what these students really had for you. So we actually have a question for Jen from Jessica.
How do I know which is the right test for me to take?
Obviously, Jessica there referring to the SAT, the ACT, the SAT-2s. How do kids determine which is the right test for them to take?
Well, there's an opportunity for students often in the sophomore, junior years to be able to take what we call predictive testing, a sort of pre-SAT, pre-ACT. And I encourage students, especially in the sophomore year, to start as early as possible and take those tests and see how they fare. It's a good indicator of how they're going to do on the actual exam, and it also gives them a good gauge for how and where they actually need to get additional support in terms of test prep and in terms of just adding some additional support to really be able to round out the test scores.
What about those kids that maybe want to take both? Is there any negative to doing that? Do the colleges only look at one or the other, or do they take both tests into account when you do take more than one?
There's no negative drawback. Schools often will look at both. I mean, there's no preference for, especially at the competitive institutions, there's really no preference in terms of scores. We have seen that students on the coasts historically have taken the SATs, whereas students in the sort of inner part of the country have really stuck with the ACT. But the reality is that either score will suffice, and the colleges will take the higher of the two.
Score choice. It's something that a lot of people have heard about, maybe don't know exactly what it means. So can you first go into what exactly score choice is, and then when kids should and maybe shouldn't use it?
Sure. Score choice is an option that students have for really suppressing a score that they think is not desirable, or a score that they wouldn't want colleges to see. I would say for the most part, it's really a sort of psychological benefit. I mean, I think the fact that students have the option of suppressing the score later on is really something that helps them sometimes if they're a little bit anxious about the test itself. But the reality is that colleges, no matter how many scores the students submit, colleges will take the highest scores. So if you took or you sat for the SAT 3 times, colleges are going to cherry pick and take the highest verbal, the highest math, and the highest writing. So I don't think that it's ever really necessary in reality. In fact, some colleges actually don't want students to suppress the scores at all, and they require that students actually submit all of them.
So that is something, though, as you being someone who used to be in the admissions process, that is true. These kids really can take the test multiple times and they'll just look at your top scores.
Absolutely. I've found it to be the case that the colleges will take a look, and like I said, they will combine the highest scores on each of the sections and come up with the highest composite score that really benefits the student in the process.
Does it matter where the student takes the test? At whatever school they're at, relation in the country, do you guys look at that at all?
It doesn't matter at all where a student takes the test. A student could sit for a test in New York or Iowa or California. The scores are going to be the same. The standard of actually grading the writing exam, for example, is going to be the same. And when there is some kind of a discrepancy between the graders, for example, in the writing component, a master grader will come in and sort of break the tie. So there are some standards that are set for really having universal, a universal score, if you will, and it won't matter where a student sits for the exam.
What about when they take the test? When should these students start to get into the standardized testing?
Sure. I think that a good time would be to start in the sophomore year, to start at least with the practice exams, and certainly continue into the junior year with the PSATs, with the plan exams. I think in the fall, or rather the spring of junior year, would be good for students to actually sit for the actual SAT at that point, and then perhaps sit again in the senior year. In terms of SAT 2 subject tests, I encourage students to take those upon completion of the actual courses. So if a student knows that he or she wants to be a biology major and is completing a biology course in 9th or 10th grade, it makes sense to take the exam at that point while the information is still fresh in their mind.
What about some tips for these kids to maybe enhance their testing profile? The one thing that comes to mind with me is, you know, you've got this new writing section that's just recently been added to the SAT, making it at a 2,400 instead of just at a 1,600 with the math and the verbal. Do all of these schools weigh each of these sections equally, or would it be beneficial for a student to maybe focus more on the traditional SAT, the math and the verbal, rather than all three?
For competitive admissions, the writing is important. Competitive institutions, top schools, if you will, and I'm not just talking about the Ivies, I'm talking about a host of schools throughout the country. They've always required additional, what were considered writing subject tests or SAT 2s. So the writing will continue to be important. There are some schools out there that never required an additional writing SAT 2. And for those schools, the writing component isn't as important. But I would say that students should really think about the test sort of holistically and really consider all the different parts and make sure that they're really prepared for all of them.
All right, and the last thing here, any additional tips, as you being someone who's been there, that these students can enhance their profile, make it look as good as possible for these college admissions?
I would say in general, yes. Take a look at your academic transcript. Try to take the most competitive courses that you can, the AP, the honors courses that are available to you. In terms of extracurricular activities, get involved in activities that are interesting and important for you. Really try to excel in those areas. And then finally, as you're taking these tests, as you're starting off with these practice tests, make sure that you get some prep, make sure that you're really enhancing your profile so that you can compete for the schools that are of interest to you.
Jen Duran, some great information. Thank you so much for taking out the time today.